Forget the fairy tale. Princess Louise Sophie was trapped in a prison marriage between two of Imperial Germany's most dangerous men, a paranoid husband and a ruthless emperor. Isolated behind the walls of Glinica Palace, she became collateral damage in a toxic power struggle that turned her privilege into a life sentence. Princess Louise Sophie was born into a paradox. She was a member of the House of Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg-Augustenburg. It was a grand name, an ancient name, but in the mid-19th century, it was a name synonymous with political headache. Her family had been on the losing side of Prussia's aggressive expansion. They were the dispossessed, the royals whose lands had been swallowed up to feed the growing German Empire. However, destiny, or rather dynastic politics, had a strange way of correcting itself. Louise Sophie's older sister was Augusta Victoria, known to the family as Dona. Dona had married Wilhelm II, the young, brash, and volatile German emperor. This marriage turned the Augustenburg sisters from political liabilities into the closest relations of the throne. When Wilhelm became Kaiser in 1888, Louise Sophie ceased to be merely a princess of a minor duchy. She became the sister of the Empress of Germany. She was 23 years old in 1889, described by contemporaries not as a ravishing beauty like the famous Austrian Empress Sisi, but as possessing a quiet, distinctively German dignity. She was blonde, blue-eyed, dutiful, and pious, the perfect image of a Prussian princess. She was the spare to her sister's heir, a supporting player expected to marry well and maintain the dignity of the new imperial age. But in the Hohenzollern court, marrying well did not mean marrying for happiness. It meant marrying for territory, for money, or for reconciliation. And so the machinery of the state selected a husband for her. The man chosen was Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia. On paper, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Friedrich Leopold was the son of Prince Friedrich Karl, the legendary Red Prince, a field marshal who had brutally and brilliantly led Prussian troops to victory against Denmark and France. By marrying the daughter of the dispossessed Augustenburgs to the son of the general who had defeated them, the court was symbolically burying the hatchet. It was a marriage meant to heal old wounds. Instead, it created a fresh, festering new one. Prince Friedrich Leopold was, to put it mildly, a problem. In the rigid, hyper-masculine culture of the Prussian officer corps, he was an anomaly. He was incredibly wealthy, inheriting a fortune that made him financially independent of the Kaiser, a dangerous thing in an autocracy. But it wasn't his money that worried the court, it was his mind. He was known behind his back as the Grand Eccentric. In a society that valued stoicism, Friedrich Leopold was dramatic. In a military culture that valued camaraderie, he was aloof and haughty. He was obsessed with the trappings of his rank, often changing his uniform 4 or 5 times a day to suit the specific hour or the specific room he was entering. He demanded a level of ceremony in his private life that even the emperor found exhausting. More dangerously, Friedrich Leopold and Kaiser Wilhelm II despised each other. It was a hatred born of proximity. They were cousins. They were both grandsons of the Hohenzollern dynasty, but they were polar opposites. Wilhelm was erratic but desperate to be loved and respected as a modern warlord. Friedrich Leopold was simply arrogant, viewing Wilhelm as a noisy upstart. The Kaiser often referred to Friedrich Leopold's branch of the family with thinly veiled contempt, while Friedrich Leopold viewed the Kaiser's constant meddling as an insult to his autonomy. This was the minefield Louise Sophie walked into on her wedding day, June 24th, 1889. The ceremony at Charlottenburg Palace was a glittering display of imperial power. The elite of Europe watched as the Empress's sister married the Red Prince's son. It looked like the beginning of a golden era. But almost immediately, the doors of the Jagdschloss Glienicke closed, and the silence descended. Glienicke was a beautiful estate, an Italianate villa nestled in the forest near Potsdam, overlooking the Havel River. It should have been a paradise. Under Friedrich Leopold's rule, it became a barracks. The prince ran his household with a discipline that would have been excessive for a penal battalion. He was obsessed with correctness. The servants lived in terror of his inspections. The gardens were manicured to within an inch of their lives, and his wife, Louise Sophie, was expected to be the crown jewel in this perfectly ordered, airless collection. The isolation Louise Sophie faced was absolute. In the early years of her marriage, she did her duty with heartbreaking precision. She gave birth to 4 children in rapid succession: Princess Victoria Margaret in 1890, Prince Friedrich Sigismund in 1891, Prince Friedrich Karl in 1893, and Prince Friedrich Leopold Jr. in 1895. She provided the heirs. She sat perfectly still at the dinner parties. She wore the jewels. But the atmosphere at Glienicke was becoming toxic. Friedrich Leopold's behavior was growing more erratic. He was prone to fits of rage if protocol was breached. He spent money with a manic intensity, renovating, buying art, buying horses, while simultaneously engaging in petty, expensive lawsuits with his neighbors and even his own family over minor boundary disputes. He was a man who needed to control everything because perhaps he felt out of control of himself. The Kaiser watched all of this from Berlin with growing fury. Wilhelm II was a man who believed that the private lives of his family members were matters of state security. If a Hohenzollern prince looked ridiculous, the empire looked ridiculous. Wilhelm began to hear rumors of the strange goings-on at Glienicke, the screaming matches, the bizarre punishments the prince inflicted on his staff, the gloom that hung over Louise Sophie. For Wilhelm, this was personal. Louise Sophie was his wife's sister. Every time he saw the Empress crying over a letter from Glienicke, his anger toward Friedrich Leopold deepened. He began to look for an excuse to intervene. He wanted to bring his cousin to heel. He wanted to assert his authority as the all-highest over this rogue prince. For years, the tension simmered. The couple would appear at court functions, smiling frozen smiles before retreating back to their fortress in Potsdam. The public saw a wealthy, royal couple. The family saw a disaster waiting to happen. Then came the winter of 1895 to 1896. It was a severe winter. The temperatures in Brandenburg plummeted, turning the lakes around Potsdam into sheets of iron-gray ice. In the late 19th century, before cinema or radio, ice skating was one of the few true escapes for the aristocracy. It was one of the only times when the rigid rules of deportment were relaxed. On the ice, you could move fast. You could feel the wind. For a woman like Louise Sophie, whose life was scripted down to the minute, the ice must have looked like freedom. Prince Friedrich Leopold was an avid skater. It fit his personality. It was solitary, elegant, and athletic. He prided himself on his physical fitness, another legacy of his famous father. Naturally, if the prince skated, the household skated. By January 1896, the ice on the Glienicke Lake was deemed ready. Or at least, the prince deemed it ready. On the ice of the Glienicke Lake, domestic drama would soon turn into near-fatal tragedy. While the precise date is debated in the archives, the event itself is etched in the record. It was a gray, biting day. The prince, Princess Louise Sophie, and a small retinue of servants and ladies-in-waiting went down to the water's edge. The prince, confident and commanding, ventured out. Louise Sophie followed. She was accompanied by one of her ladies-in-waiting, a noblewoman whose duty was to shadow the princess everywhere. They were skating near the Glinica Bridge, the famous Bridge of Spies of the later Cold War era. In 1896, it was just a quiet, frozen span connecting Potsdam to Berlin. The ice is a deceptive thing. It can be a foot thick in 1 meter and paper thin in the next, weakened by currents or underwater springs. As Louise Sophie glided further from the bank, perhaps distracted by the rare sensation of speed, perhaps following a command from her husband to keep up, she hit a patch of rotten ice. There was no warning, no slow cracking to give them time to retreat. The surface simply disintegrated. In a heartbeat, the Princess of Prussia and her companion were swallowed by the black water. The shock was instantaneous. The water temperature was near freezing. The human body's immediate reaction is the gasp reflex, an uncontrollable inhalation. If you are underwater when that happens, you drown instantly. Louise Sophie struggled to the surface, gasping for air, thrashing in the broken shards of ice. But the water wasn't the only danger. The fashion of 1896 was a death trap. Louise Sophie was likely wearing a heavy wool skating costume, perhaps a velvet jacket, multiple petticoats and corsetry. Within seconds, this fabric absorbed gallons of water. The weight would have been immense, dragging her down like an anchor. The scene turned into chaos. Screams rang out across the frozen lake. The prince, realizing what had happened, began shouting orders. Guards and servants scrambled across the slippery surface, risking their own lives to reach the 2 women thrashing in the hole. It was a matter of seconds, not minutes. If they had been further out, or if the servants had hesitated, Louise Sophie would have died. She would have been dragged under the ice by the weight of her own clothes. But hands grabbed her. They hauled her, coughing and freezing, out of the black water and onto the solid ice. She was shivering violently, her lips blue, in a state of profound shock. The lady-in-waiting was pulled out beside her. They were rushed back to the palace. The fires were stoked, the doctors were summoned. Physically, the princess would survive. She was young and strong, but politically, she had just handed the Kaiser the weapon he had been waiting for. News traveled fast in Imperial Berlin, especially bad news. When word reached the city palace that the emperor's sister-in-law had nearly drowned because of what looked like the prince's negligence, the reaction was volcanic. To Kaiser Wilhelm II, this was not an accident. This was proof. It was proof that Friedrich Leopold was incompetent. It was proof that he lacked the judgment required of a Prussian prince. How could a man who couldn't even check the thickness of the ice before sending his wife onto it be trusted with a regiment? How could he be trusted with the dignity of the House of Hohenzollern? The Kaiser saw an opportunity to do what he had wanted to do for a decade: crush Friedrich Leopold's independence. Wilhelm II ignored the pleasantries of a get-well card. Instead, he issued a command. In a move that stunned the Berlin aristocracy, the Kaiser issued a cabinet order, a formal military directive. He declared that Prince Friedrich Leopold had failed in his duty as the head of his household. The punishment was swift and humiliatingly public. The Kaiser ordered Prince Friedrich Leopold to be placed under house arrest. It sounds almost childish to modern ears. Go to your room. But in the context of the 19th century military aristocracy, this was a nuclear option. Friedrich Leopold was a general of the cavalry. He was a royal highness. To be confined to his quarters like a delinquent cadet was a stain on his honor that could never be washed away. The order specified a confinement of 14 days, 2 weeks, but the Kaiser didn't stop there. He didn't trust Friedrich Leopold to obey. Wilhelm sent members of the Garde du Corps, the emperor's personal bodyguard regiment, to surround Jagdschloss Glinica. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. Louise Sophie lay in bed recovering from near drowning, traumatized and weak. Outside her window, she sees the uniforms of her brother-in-law's soldiers patrolling the perimeter. Inside, her husband is pacing his study, incandescent with rage, a prisoner in his own home. The message was clear. You are not in charge here. The Kaiser is. This was the moment the marriage effectively ended, even if it would legally drag on for decades. The illusion of a partnership was gone. Friedrich Leopold blamed the Kaiser, but he surely also directed his resentment toward Louise Sophie. She was the cause of his humiliation. If she hadn't fallen in, he wouldn't be a prisoner. For Louise Sophie, the 14 days of house arrest were likely a period of terrifying clarity. She realized that she was not a wife, and she was not a sister. She was a pawn. She was the battlefield on which these two men were fighting their war of ego. And as the soldiers marched outside in the snow guarding the golden cage, Louise Sophie must have realized that the ice she fell through was the only thing that had been real. Everything else, the titles, the respect, the safety, was just a thin layer of frost over a very deep, very cold abyss. But the Kaiser wasn't finished. The house arrest was just the opening salvo. Wilhelm had tasted blood, and he decided that if Friedrich Leopold couldn't manage a skating party, he certainly couldn't manage the education of his sons. The accident on the ice set in motion a series of events that would strip Louise Sophie of the one thing she had left, her children. The ice had broken on the Havel, but the chill that settled over Jägdschloss Glienicke in the years following 1896 was permanent. The physical wounds from the skating accident healed quickly enough. Louise Sophie was a woman of robust constitution, bred from stock that knew how to endure harsh northern winters. But the humiliation inflicted by Kaiser Wilhelm II did not fade. In fact, it festered. If you were a visitor to the Prussian court in the late 1890s, you might have noticed a peculiar absence. The emperor's sister-in-law and her husband were seen less and less. When they did appear, there was a stiffness, a forced quality to their smiles that even the rigid etiquette of Berlin could not entirely mask. Behind the high walls of their estate, Prince Friedrich Leopold had turned inward. The house arrest order had been lifted, the soldiers had marched back to their barracks, but the prince had constructed his own psychological fortress. He became the jailer of his own family. The ice incident had confirmed Friedrich Leopold's deepest paranoia. His cousin, the Kaiser, was out to destroy him. And in a twisted way, he wasn't entirely wrong. Wilhelm II had tasted the power of intervention. He had successfully disciplined a royal highness like a recalcitrant schoolboy, and the sky hadn't fallen. The Kaiser, a man whose entire life was a performance of strength to compensate for his withered arm and his deep insecurities, found a strange satisfaction in micromanaging the Glienicke problem. For Louise Sophie, life became a series of closed doors. Her husband's eccentricity, once just a source of gossip, hardened into something darker. He became obsessed with ceremonial perfection within his own household, perhaps to compensate for the lack of respect he received outside of it. The servants were drilled like guardsmen. The protocols for meals, for dressing, for walking in the gardens became labyrinthine. Louise Sophie was the silent witness to this theater of the absurd, trapped in a marriage where any deviation from the script could trigger a rage that would reach the ears of her powerful brother-in-law. But the Kaiser was not content to just watch from a distance. Wilhelm II had a vision for the House of Hohenzollern. It was a vision of hypermasculinity, of soldier kings, of men made of iron and leather. He looked at Friedrich Leopold with his perfumes, his obsession with costume, his artistic affectations, and his blatant disregard for military duty, and he saw a contaminant. He saw a man who was everything a Prussian prince should not be. And then he looked at the children. By the turn of the century, Louise Sophie and Friedrich Leopold had 3 sons, Friedrich Sigismund, Friedrich Karl, and Friedrich Leopold Jr. They were growing up in the hothouse atmosphere of Glienicke, surrounded by luxury, shielded from the world by their father's wealth. To the Kaiser, this was a catastrophe in the making. He believed that the boys were being ruined. He believed they were being raised as dandies rather than as Prussian officers. The Kaiser decided he needed more than rumors. He needed ammunition. In 1904, a shadow fell over Glienicke, though Louise Sophie likely didn't see it until it was too late. Wilhelm II did something that was, by the standards of the time, breathtakingly intrusive. He authorized a covert investigation into the private life of his own cousin. He didn't send a court chamberlain or a family mediator. He sent Gustav Steinhauer. The name Gustav Steinhauer might not ring a bell today, but in Imperial Germany, it was a name whispered with fear. Steinhauer was the Kaiser's shadow. He was a former Pinkerton detective who had been brought back to Germany to serve as the head of the Kaiser's personal secret police. His job was usually to hunt down anarchists, socialist agitators, and foreign spies. He was a man who lived in the underworld of espionage, and now his target was a royal highness. Imagine the level of distrust required for an emperor to unleash his spy master on his wife's sister's family. Steinhauer's agents began to quietly compile a dossier on life inside Glienicke. They spoke to disgruntled former servants. They watched who came and went. They tracked the prince's spending. They noted the arguments, the strange hours, the flashes of temper. The report that Steinhauer delivered to the Kaiser's desk has been lost to the chaos of history, but we can infer its contents from the explosion it caused. It likely painted a picture of a household that was financially reckless and morally soft, at least by the Spartan standards of Prussian militarism. It probably detailed Friedrich Leopold's tyrannical behavior toward his wife and his suffocating coddling of his sons. Wilhelm II read the report, and he made a decision that would break Louise Sophie's heart. He decided that Friedrich Leopold was unfit to raise Prussian princes. The state, embodied by the Kaiser, would take them. It was a quiet morning in 1904 when the order came down. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command from the supreme warlord. The 3 young princes, Friedrich Sigismund, age 13, Friedrich Karl, age 11, and little Friedrich Leopold Jr., only 9, were to be removed from their parents' home immediately. They were to be enrolled in the Preußische Hauptkadettenanstalt at Lichterfelde. Now, sending sons to the cadet academy was a tradition for the Prussian aristocracy. It was a rite of passage, but usually it happened later, and usually the parents had some say in the matter. This was different. This was a seizure. The Kaiser was effectively declaring that the atmosphere at Glienicke was so toxic, so un-German, that the boys had to be extracted for their own salvation. For Louise Sophie, the scene must have been agonizing. She was a woman whose entire identity had been constructed around motherhood and duty. Her marriage was a sham, her social life was restricted, and her husband was a stranger. Her children were the only source of genuine warmth in the drafty corridors of Glienicke. We can imagine her standing in the grand foyer, watching as the servants packed the boys' trunks, the uniforms, the stiff collars, the miniature swords. She would have had to maintain her composure. Princesses do not weep in front of the staff. But the internal devastation would have been absolute. She was losing her babies to the machine. The boys were driven away, leaving the palace silent. Lichterfelde was not a boarding school in the modern sense. It was a factory for producing officers. The discipline was brutal. The hazing was rampant. The boys who had grown up in the eccentric, velvet-lined world of their father were suddenly thrust into a world of cold showers, pre-dawn drills, and absolute obedience. They were branded as the sons of the crazy prince, which likely made them targets for the other cadets. Back at Glienicke, the removal of the sun severed the last fragile bond between Louise Sophie and Friedrich Leopold. The prince was apoplectic. He saw this as the ultimate insult. The Kaiser had stolen his heirs. He had questioned his fatherhood. Friedrich Leopold raged against the injustice, filing complaints, threatening lawsuits, but against the All-Highest, he was powerless. And who did he blame? In the twisted logic of an abuser, he likely blamed his wife. She was the Kaiser's sister-in-law. She was the link. If she had been stronger, if she had managed the Kaiser better, this wouldn't have happened. The atmosphere in the palace turned from cold to glacial. Louise Sophie was now truly alone. Her daughter, Victoria Margaret, was still there, but she too would soon be married off. The princess spent her days wandering the manicured gardens, a ghost in her own home. She wrote letters to her sister, the Empress, begging for news of her boys, begging for permission to visit them. But the visits were strictly regulated. The Kaiser wanted to break the influence of the parents, and that meant limiting contact. The years dragged on. The golden cage had become a tomb. The world outside was changing. Automobiles were appearing on the streets of Berlin. Electricity was lighting up the night. The drumbeat of nationalism was getting louder. But inside Glienicke, time stood still. It was a purgatory of etiquette and resentment. But the cruelest irony was yet to come. The Kaiser had taken the boys to make them into soldiers. He had taken them to harden them, to prepare them for the glory of the German Empire. He succeeded. They became soldiers. They became officers. They learned to ride, to shoot, to lead men into battle. And in doing so, the Kaiser prepared them perfectly for their own destruction. By 1913, the tension in Europe was palpable. The intricate web of alliances that held the continent together was fraying. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo in June 1914 was the spark, but the powder keg had been built by men like Wilhelm II, and the very military culture that had swallowed Louise Sophie's sons. When war was declared in August 1914, the crowds in Berlin cheered. They threw flowers at the marching troops. Home by Christmas, they said. It was to be a glorious little war. For Louise Sophie, the outbreak of World War I was not a moment of patriotic fervor, but of terrifying realization. Her sons, the boys who had been torn from her arms 10 years earlier, were now men. And because they were Hohenzollerns, because they were Prussian officers, they would be at the front. Friedrich Karl, the middle son, the athlete, the one who had won an Olympic medal for Germany in 1912, was a pilot. He joined the Luftstreitkräfte, the Imperial German Air Service. It was the most dangerous, dashing, and deadly branch of the military. Friedrich Sigismund, the eldest, was a cavalry officer, eager to prove that he was not his father's son, but a true warrior of the Reich. The palace of Glienicke emptied further. The men went to war. The women waited. Louise Sophie joined the ranks of millions of German mothers, waiting for the telegrams, dreading the knock at the door. The war stripped away the pretenses of the court. The balls stopped. The glittering dinners ended. The Kaiser, once the swaggering arbiter of morals, became a harried, gray-faced warlord, overwhelmed by generals who increasingly cut him out of the decision-making loop. But for Louise Sophie, the war brought a different kind of horror. It brought the realization that the discipline and hardness that the Kaiser had forced upon her sons was leading them directly into the meat grinder. In 1917, the telegram came. It was for Friedrich Karl, the Bronze Prince, the Olympian. He had been flying a patrol over the Western Front. His aircraft had been hit. He had been forced to land behind enemy lines. He was taken prisoner by the British, but his wounds were severe. He died in a prisoner of war camp in Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray, France, on his 24th birthday. The news shattered Louise Sophie. Her son had died alone in enemy hands, far from the home he had been exiled from as a child. The Kaiser's experiment in toughening them up had ended in a lonely death in a French field hospital. The loss of Friedrich Karl was the beginning of the end. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a symbol of the collapse of the entire world Louise Sophie had been born into. The invincible German army was bleeding to death. The infallibility of the Kaiser was a lie. The sacrifices she had made, the silence, the obedience, the surrender of her children, had been for nothing. As 1918 dawned, the food shortages in Berlin became acute. Even in the palaces, the meals were meager. The coal ran out. The great halls of Glinica were freezing, and outside the gates the people were angry. The revolution was coming. And when it arrived, it wouldn't just take Louise Sophie's titles. It would take the very ground she stood on. The golden cage was about to be ripped open, not by a key, but by a crowbar. The winter of 1918 did not arrive in Berlin with the crisp, romantic snowfalls of the pre-war years. It arrived like a shroud. The city was starving. The turnip winter of 2 years prior had weakened the population. And now, 4 years into a war that was supposed to have ended in months, the German Empire was hollowed out. In the grand dining halls of Jagdschloss Glinica, the silver still gleamed and the crystal still caught the light, but the plates were largely empty. The footmen, once young and strapping, were now old men or wounded veterans with empty sleeves pinned to their uniforms. Princess Louise Sophie moved through these cold rooms like a ghost. She was 52 years old, but the war had aged her by decades. Her hair, once the golden blonde of the Schleswig-Holstein line, had faded into a steel gray. She wore mourning black, not just for the fashion of the waning court, but for her son, Friedrich Karl, who lay in a French grave. But the silence of the palace was deceptive. Outside the high iron gates, the roar of a dying empire was growing louder. In November 1918, the unthinkable happened. The German high seas fleet mutinied in Kiel. The unrest spread like a contagion through the railway lines to Berlin. Workers went on strike. Soldiers tore the imperial cockades from their caps. The unthinkable word was whispered, then shouted on the streets, Republic. For a woman like Louise Sophie, whose entire existence was predicated on the divine right of kings, this was the apocalypse. She was the sister of the Empress. Her brother-in-law was the all-highest. The idea that the mob could simply dissolve the monarchy was a blasphemy she could barely comprehend. She expected the army to crush the rebellion. She expected the Kaiser to ride into Berlin on a white horse and restore order. Instead, she watched from her window as the world turned upside down. And the first betrayal came not from the streets, but from inside her own house. Prince Friedrich Leopold, the grand eccentric, the man who had tormented her with his rigid adherence to protocol for 30 years, suddenly did something that stopped the breath in Louise Sophie's throat. As the revolutionary crowd surged towards Potsdam, waving red flags and singing the Internationale, the other royal princes barricaded their doors or fled. They prepared to defend their dynasties, but Friedrich Leopold saw which way the wind was blowing. He ordered the imperial standard, the Black Eagle of Prussia, to be lowered from the flagpole above Glienicke, and in its place he raised the red flag of the revolution. It is difficult to overstate the shock of this moment. The Kaiser's own cousin, a general of the cavalry, a man who had once arrested his own wife for an etiquette breach, had sided with the socialists. He declared himself Citizen Hohenzollern. When the revolutionary sailors arrived at the gates of Glienicke expecting a fight, they were invited in. The prince reportedly told the leaders of the Workers' and Soldiers' Council that they were welcome to use the palace, provided they wiped their boots and did not walk on the manicured lawns. For Louise Sophie, this was the final shattering humiliation. She watched as rough men in workers' caps tramped through the hallways where emperors had dined. She watched her husband, the man who had terrified her with his rages about proper conduct, fawning over the very people who were tearing down her sister's throne. It was a survival instinct, of course. Friedrich Leopold was terrified of losing his fortune. He calculated that if he played the role of the Red Prince, the revolutionaries would spare his estates. He was right. Glienicke was not looted, but the moral cost was absolute. In the midst of this farce, the news came from Spa, Belgium. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. He did not return to Berlin to die with his troops. He boarded a train and fled into exile in the Netherlands. The jailer of Europe was gone. The man who had ordered Louise Sophie's house arrest, who had taken her sons, who had dominated every aspect of her life for 3 decades, had simply run away. The golden cage was unlocked. The guards were gone. The empire was dead. Logic suggests this should have been a moment of liberation for Louise Sophie. The tyrant Kaiser was gone, and her difficult husband was distracted by his new revolutionary friends. Yet freedom did not come. But freedom, when you have been institutionalized for 30 years, is terrifying. The structure of her life collapsed. There were no more court circulars, no more ladies in waiting, no more orders from the palace. There was just a vast, terrifying silence. And then the marriage effectively ended. With the Kaiser gone, the external pressure that had forced Friedrich Leopold and Louise Sophie to maintain the facade of a royal couple vanished. There was no one left to impress. There was no one left to punish them. Friedrich Leopold, having secured his property from the revolutionaries, decided he had had enough of Germany. He had enough of the grim, starving winters. He had enough of his wife. He took a significant portion of his portable wealth and moved to Switzerland. He bought the Villa Favorita in Lugano, a sun-drenched paradise on the lake. He surrounded himself with art, with young sycophants, and with the luxury he felt he deserved. He did not take Louise Sophie. He left her behind in the drafty, echoing halls of Glienicke. He left her in a defeated nation, surrounded by a people who despised the name Hohenzollern. He controlled the purse strings from Switzerland with a vindictive precision. He reportedly rationed her allowance with the same cruelty he once applied to household inspections, ensuring that while he lived like a king in Lugano, the sister of the empress lived effectively as a pauper in her own home. Louise Sophie was stranded. She was 53, alone, and adrift in the wreckage of the Weimar Republic. The year 1919 was a nightmare of street fighting and political assassinations. The Spartacist uprising turned Berlin into a war zone. Machine guns rattled in the streets where she had once ridden in open carriages. The fear of a Russian-style execution was very real. In Ekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks had murdered the Tsar and his family, Louise's distant cousins, in a cellar. Every night, as she lay in her bed at Glienicke, Louise Sophie must have wondered if the men with the red armbands would come for her next. They didn't come. The German Revolution was less bloody than the Russian one, but it was just as thorough in its destruction of the old social order. The nobility were stripped of their legal privileges. They were just citizens now. Louise Sophie was no longer Her Royal Highness. She was, legally, just Frau Louise Sophie von Preußen, but she refused to accept it. While her husband played the bohemian in Lugano, Louise Sophie hardened. She became a symbol of the old resistance. She refused to acknowledge the Republic. She continued to dress in the pre-war style. She demanded that her shrinking staff address her by her royal titles. She clung to the wreckage of the past because the present was too painful to bear. And then the pestilence arrived. The Spanish flu had been stalking Europe since 1918, killing more people than the machine guns. It moved in waves, striking the young and the healthy with terrifying speed. It did not care about titles. In 1923, tragedy struck Louise Sophie again. Her daughter, Princess Victoria Margaret, was 33 years old. She had married Prince Heinrich the 33rd Reuss, a man from another ancient deposed family, and they had children. She was the one bright spot remaining in Louise's life, the one child who had survived the war and the madness of her father, but the flu found her. In the cramped, coal-starved Germany of 1923, the year of hyperinflation, when a loaf of bread cost 1 billion marks, medical care was scarce even for princes. Victoria Margaret contracted the virus. Within days, she was dead. Louise Sophie stood by yet another grave. First Friedrich Karl in the clay of France, now Victoria Margaret in the family crypt. She had buried 2 of her 4 children. The grief of 1923 was different from 1917. In 1917, there was a nation to mourn with her. Friedrich Karl had died a hero. In 1923, Victoria Margaret died as a relic of a forgotten era. The newspapers barely noted it. The people were too busy trying to find food to care about the death of a princess. Louise Sophie retreated further into the shadows of Glienicke. The palace was falling into disrepair. The gardens, once the obsession of her husband, were overgrown. The paint peeled. The heating was rarely turned on because coal was too expensive. She began to live a life of almost monastic seclusion. She read the old letters from her sister, the Empress Donna, who had died in exile in Dorn in 1921, allegedly of a broken heart. She looked at the photographs of the skating parties, the balls, the parades. There is a profound loneliness in outliving your own history. Louise Sophie was a walking anachronism. When she ventured out into Potsdam, people stared. She looked like a figure from a museum, a black-clad reminder of the days when the Kaiser ruled the world. Her husband, meanwhile, was living a very different life in Switzerland. Friedrich Leopold had become a local celebrity in Lugano. He was the eccentric prince, the man who lit his cigarettes with banknotes, or so the rumors said, the man who held court in his villa while his wife shivered in Prussia. He made no effort to reconcile. He made no effort to comfort her after the death of their daughter. The separation was absolute. It was not a divorce in the legal sense. Divorce was still a scandal the older generation could not stomach, but it was a divorce of the soul. He had exited the stage of their shared tragedy, leaving her to clean up the mess. The 1920s roared on. Jazz music, cabaret, the decadence of Weimar Berlin. It was all happening just a few miles away. But at Glienicke, the clock seemed to have stopped in 1914. Louise Sophie lived for her remaining sons, Friedrich Sigismund and Friedrich Leopold Jr. Friedrich Sigismund, the eldest, was a passionate horseman. He was a man who, like many of his generation, struggled to find a place in the New World. He had been trained to command cavalry charges, not to navigate a democratic republic. He found solace in sport, in the adrenaline of steeplechasing. He was the heir. He was the future of the line. But the curse of the Glinica ice seemed to follow the family, transforming into new shapes. In 1927, Friedrich Sigismund was riding in a tournament near Hamburg. It was a difficult jump. The horse clipped the barrier. The fall was catastrophic. The news traveled back to Glinica by telephone, a modern intrusion into the silent palace. The crown prince of this broken branch of the family, the survivor of the trenches, was dead. He was 35. Louise Sophie had now lost 3 children. Imagine the silence in the palace that night, the sheer crushing weight of it. She sat in the darkness, the last guardian of a dead legacy. The Kaiser was chopping wood in Holland. Her husband was drinking wine in Switzerland. Her sister was dead. Her sons were dead. Her daughter was dead. She was 61 years old. She had survived the drowning in the ice, the wrath of the Kaiser, the theft of her children, the Great War, the Revolution, the betrayal of her husband, and the Spanish flu. But survival, she was learning, was not a victory. It was a sentence. She was the custodian of ghosts. And as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, a new noise began to rise in Germany. It wasn't the chaotic shouting of the 1918 revolution. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thudding. It was the sound of marching boots, brown shirts, swastikas. The world was changing again. And for a woman like Louise Sophie, desperate for order, desperate for a return to the glory of the past, this new movement offered a seductive, dangerous promise. The Nazis spoke of restoring German honor. They spoke of discipline. They spoke of the betrayal of 1918. To a lonely, bitter princess in a crumbling palace, Hitler did not look like a monster. He looked like a correction. But if Louise Sophie thought the rise of the Third Reich would restore her world, she was tragically mistaken. The new masters of Germany had no use for the old Hohenzollern dignity. They didn't want monarchs. They wanted compliance. And the final act of her life would not be a restoration. It would be a slow, quiet fade into total obscurity while the world burned for a second time. The silence that descended upon Jagdschloss Glinica after the death of Prince Friedrich Sigismund in 1927 was not merely the absence of noise, it was the presence of a void. Princess Louise Sophie was now 61 years old. In the span of a single decade, she had buried 3 of her 4 children. The nursery rooms, once the site of the Kaiser's paranoia and her own maternal devotion, were now mausoleums of memory, filled with the toys and uniforms of ghosts. But history, cruel and relentless, does not pause for a mother's grief. While Louise Sophie wandered the overgrown paths of her estate, the world outside her gates was convulsing. The fragile stability of the Weimar Republic was shattering under the weight of the Great Depression. The streets of Berlin, only a few miles away, were becoming battlegrounds between communists and National Socialists. In 1931, another chapter of her life closed, though without the sharp pang of loss she felt for her children. In the sun-drenched luxury of his villa in Lugano, Switzerland, Prince Friedrich Leopold died. The grand eccentric, the man who had terrified her with his rages, the husband who had sided with the revolutionaries to save his fortune, finally succumbed to his own mortality. His death was a strange, muted affair for Louise Sophie. There was no tearful reconciliation. There were no final words of forgiveness. He had lived apart from her for 12 years, spending the family fortune on art and whims, while she shivered in the drafty halls of Prussia. When his body was brought back to Glinica for burial, it was a collision of two worlds. The prince, who had raised the red flag in 1918, was laid to rest in the family crypt, next to the sons he had failed to protect. For Louise Sophie, burying her husband was less an act of mourning and more an administrative duty. It was the final locking of a door that should have been sealed decades ago. She was now a widow. The legal and social chains that had bound her to him were broken, but the damage was done. She was the custodian of a ruined legacy. However, the death of the prince brought a new, terrified uncertainty. Friedrich Leopold had been the financial anchor, however erratic. With his death, the estate was plunged into legal chaos. The inheritance was tangled, the debts were significant, and the political climate was darkening. It was against this backdrop of personal desolation and financial fear that the 1930s arrived, and with them came a new seduction. By 1933, the German aristocracy was desperate, humiliated by the loss of the war and stripped of their status by the Republic. They were terrified of the communists, whom they viewed as godless barbarians waiting to burn down their palaces. Then came Adolf Hitler. For a woman like Louise Sophie, raised in the rigid hierarchy of the empire, the Nazis did not initially look like gangsters. They looked like a restoration. They wore uniforms. They marched in lockstep. They spoke of honor, fatherland, and discipline. They promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, the document that had branded Germany a pariah nation. Many of the Hohenzollerns, including Louise Sophie's own nephews, the sons of the Kaiser, were seduced by the brown shirts. Prince August Wilhelm, her nephew, was an enthusiastic Nazi marching in SA parades. The former crown prince flirted with the party, believing he could use Hitler to restore the monarchy. Louise Sophie, isolated and yearning for the order of the past, likely viewed the events of January 1933, when Hitler was named chancellor, with a cautious, perhaps desperate, hope. The day of Potsdam, in March 1933, when Hitler bowed to the old Field Marshal Hindenburg at the garrison church just a stone's throw from Glinica, was designed specifically to appeal to people like her. It was a visual promise that the Third Reich would be a continuation of the Second Reich. It was a lie, of course, a magnificent, lethal lie. As the 1930s progressed, the true nature of the regime revealed itself. The Nazis had no interest in restoring the monarchy. They were not monarchists. They were totalitarians. The royal highnesses were useful as window dressing, as props to lend legitimacy to the regime, but they were to have no real power. Louise Sophie found herself in a strange twilight existence. She was treated with a certain deference by the local Nazi officials in Potsdam. After all, she was the Kaiser's sister-in-law, but she was watched. The golden cage of the Imperial era had been replaced by a cage of glass. The Gestapo, the new secret police, were far more efficient and far more ruthless than the Kaiser's old spy, Gustav Steinhauer. The illusion of a restored Germany began to crack for her in 1936. Berlin hosted the Olympics. The city was cleaned up. The anti-Semitic signs were temporarily taken down, and the world was invited to marvel at the new Germany. For Louise Sophie, the Olympics must have been a bitter torment. 24 years earlier, in 1912, her son Friedrich Karl had won a bronze medal for the German Empire. He had been a hero, a symbol of Prussian excellence. Now the stadium was filled with swastikas, and her son was a memory in a French grave. The cheers of the crowd were not for the Hohenzollerns, they were for the Führer, and then the darkness truly. In 1939, the radio crackled with the news that German troops had crossed into Poland. World War II had begun. This war was different. In 1914, there had been flowers and singing. In 1939, there was a grim, silent resignation. Louise Sophie was now 73 years old. She had seen the Franco-Prussian War as a child, the Great War as a mother, and now this new cataclysm as an old woman. The isolation at Glienicke deepened. The young men of the estate were drafted. The horses were requisitioned. The food rationing returned stricter than before. The blackout curtains were drawn every night, turning the palace into a tomb. But the war was not just an external threat. It came for her family again. And this time, the irony was so sharp, it could cut glass. Her only surviving son was Friedrich Leopold Jr. He was the baby of the family, the one who had been 9 years old when the Kaiser's soldiers took him away to the cadet academy. He had survived the First World War, but the trauma of his upbringing and the chaos of the post-war years had left him scarred. Friedrich Leopold Jr. was not a Nazi. In fact, he was known to be critical of the regime. He listened to foreign radio broadcasts, a capital crime. He spoke out of turn. In the paranoia of the Third Reich, being a royal did not protect you, it made you a target. The Nazis were deeply suspicious of the old aristocracy, fearing they might plot a coup. In 1944, the unthinkable happened. The Gestapo came for him. They did not come to salute him. They came to arrest him. Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia, the nephew of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, was thrown into a concentration camp. He was sent to Dachau. Consider the trajectory of this family. The father, Friedrich Leopold Sr., had been a brutal Prussian general. The uncle, the Kaiser, had been the supreme warlord. And now the last son was a prisoner of the very state that claimed to be the heir to Prussian glory. For Louise Sophie, sitting alone in Glienicke, this news must have been the final shattering of her world. The order she had hoped the Nazis would restore had turned into a monstrous machine that was eating her own child. The Kaiser had taken her sons to make them soldiers. Hitler had taken her son to make him a prisoner. The betrayal was absolute. The year 1944 bled into 1945. The war turned. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in flames. The air raids on Berlin became relentless. The night sky over Glienicke glowed red, not from the sunset, but from the burning capital. The ground shook with the impact of 1,000-pound bombs. Louise Sophie, a frail woman in her late 70s, had to be helped down into the cellars as the RAF and the USAAF pounded the city into rubble. There's a specific visceral terror in being old and helpless in a war zone. The sheer noise, the anti-aircraft flak, the whistle of falling bombs is physically painful. But worse than the bombs was the news from the east. The Wehrmacht was broken. The Red Army was advancing. In the spring of 1945, the rumors turned into panic. Ivan is coming. The stories of what was happening in East Prussia, the looting, the rapes, the executions, filtered back to Potsdam. For the aristocracy, this was the ultimate nightmare. They were the class enemy. To the Soviet soldiers, a palace like Glienicke was not a piece of history. It was a symbol of centuries of oppression. Louise Sophie faced a choice that no one should have to make at the age of 78. To stay was suicide. To leave was to abandon the only life she knew. Glienicke was not just a house. It was the place where she had come as a bride. It was the place where she had fallen through the ice. It was the place where she had raised her children. It was the place where they were buried. Her husband, her daughter, her sons, their bones were in the ground of this estate, but the artillery was getting louder. The horizon to the east was flashing with muzzle fire. In April 1945, just days before the Soviet encirclement of Berlin was complete, the decision was made. There would be no Grand Imperial train. There would be no retinue of servants. It was a frantic, terrifying scramble. Louise Sophie packed what she could into a few trunks, photographs, perhaps a few pieces of jewelry sewn into the lining of a coat. The silver was left behind. The portraits of her ancestors were left staring at the empty walls. She walked out of Jagdschloss Glienicke for the last time. She did not look back. To look back was to turn to salt. The journey westward was a descent into hell. The roads were clogged with refugees, millions of Germans fleeing the Soviet advance. Old women pushing handcarts, children crying, wounded soldiers limping along the ditches. The Luftwaffe was gone. Soviet fighters strafed the refugee columns at will. We do not have a precise day-by-day account of her flight, and perhaps that is a mercy. We can only imagine the physical agony of a woman of her age, accustomed to the finest comforts of Europe, sleeping in barns or on the roadside, hungry, thirsty, and terrified. She was no longer Her Royal Highness. She was just another gray-haired woman in a sea of misery, indistinguishable from the peasant wives and the shopkeepers' widows. The irony of her life had reached its crescendo. She had spent decades trapped in a golden cage, longing for freedom. Now she was free. The walls were gone. The protocol was gone. But this freedom was the freedom of the refugee, the freedom of having nothing left to lose because everything has already been taken. She eventually made it to the American zone of occupation. She survived the trek, but the woman who arrived in the West was a shell. She had outlived her dynasty, her country, her home, and her era. While Louise Sophie escaped to the West, becoming a displaced person in her own land, the Red Army seized Glienicke. They transformed her former home into an officer's casino and a sports club, looting the wine cellars and smashing the furniture. She had survived, but she left behind everything: her history, her home, and the graves of her husband and children, now abandoned in the shadow of the Iron Curtain. She settled in a modest house in Bad Oberdorf, Bavaria. To the locals, she was just another refugee with nothing but the clothes on her back. Few knew that the old woman holding her spine rigid in the wooden chair was the sister of the last German empress. Even the reunion with her only surviving son, Friedrich Leopold Jr., offered no comfort. He had survived the horrors of Dachau, but he was a broken man. Mother and son, one shattered by the Nazis, the other a relic of the empire that birthed them, drifted apart. Louise Sophie spent her final years in profound solitude. She had outlived her dynasty, her country, and her era. She lived in poverty, counting every lump of coal, while memories of glittering balls and imperial parades faded into the gray reality of post-war Germany. On April 4th, 1952, at the age of 86, she died. There were no flags at half-mast, no state funeral. Since her family crypt was in enemy territory in the east, she was buried in the west, far from her husband, far from her children, and far from the lake where the ice had once broken. Today, Jagdschloss Glienicke is a restored UNESCO World Heritage Site, beautiful and polished for tourists, but the guidebooks offer only footnotes about Louise Sophie. They mention the titles, but they miss the truth. The metaphor of the ice remains inescapable. In 1896, the surface cracked, revealing the abyss. For the next 50 years, Louise Sophie simply trod water in the freezing currents of history. Her grave bears no imperial eagle, just a name and dates, a princess of Prussia, a refugee of history. And finally, in the silence of the earth, free,